Well, good morning everybody. As always, thanks for joining me. I hope you're having a great day so far, and it means a lot that you guys are coming back to check out my videos. It really helps me out and I appreciate it so much. So over the past couple months, I've been doing a ton of lake trout fishing through the ice. And when I say a ton, I mean I've become absolutely addicted to it, and I haven't even gone ice fishing for any other species in like months now. In my opinion, lake trout fishing through the ice is by far the most fun ice fishing experience that you will have for any species here in Alaska. I've put out several videos over the past couple months here on my YouTube channel of lake trout fishing, and I've posted all kind of other stuff about it on my Facebook page. And every single time that I post something, I get all kind of questions, tons of messages of people asking me what kind of bait do I use, what kind of lures, what time of day, what depth, location, all that kind of stuff. So I figured it was probably about time that I just go ahead and make a video for you guys, kind of detailing how I personally fish for lake trout, and hopefully it'll help you guys out. I also wanted to give you guys just a real quick update on my channel and what I've been up to since I haven't really posted much in the last couple weeks. So the last couple weeks here in South Central Alaska have been super weird for the month of April. Normally right now in the middle of April to the end of April, it's still below or just above freezing, and there's tons of snow and ice still on the ground. The lakes are still frozen over, but not this year. Spring breakup came way early, and it's actually been above 60 degrees Fahrenheit the past couple weeks now, and it hasn't really got down below freezing even at nighttime in about 2 weeks. So absolutely crazy, but unfortunately that has made ice conditions out on the lakes unsafe, obviously, and in fact most of the ice is actually almost melted off the lakes, and we're almost back to the open water season. In addition to that, all the flowing water in the Matanuska-Susitna Valley has been closed for the trout spawn. It usually happens this time of year between April 15th and June 15th. So for the next few weeks, we're not going to have any fishing in flowing water here in the valley, and I also can't go ice fishing, and I also can't really go lake fishing because of the ice situation on the lakes right now. So that is why I haven't really been posting anything here on my channel. It's been really tough times trying to get out there and do any kind of fishing, let alone film videos. But I have been active. There is one lake way out in the interior that I have been driving out to pretty frequently. I've been out there 3 times within the past 3 weeks, which for the distance it is, that's quite a lot. It's about a 3-hour drive from where I live, and that is the legendary Lake Louise. This lake has huge lakers, huge burbot, and it's an absolute blast to fish. This is my personal best lake trout that I caught on an anniversary trip to Lake Louise with my wife a few weeks ago. This big girl measured in at about 34 inches. We stayed at the Lake Louise Lodge in cabin number 1, which was absolutely awesome. The cabin has a beautiful view of Lake Louise right out the front door, a piping hot propane heater, and plenty of room. The owners of the lodge and the people that work there really do an amazing job at making you feel right at home, with delicious home-cooked meals in the restaurant, plenty of local beers on tap at the bar, and all the amenities that you'll need to stay comfortable and warm. I went to the lake again the following weekend on an ice camping trip with my brother-in-law, who caught this awesome lake trout and his very first burbot, which he brought home and fried up, and let me tell you, it was delicious. We actually ended up filming an entire video, which I intended to get put together and posted here to my YouTube channel, but unfortunately, about an hour before we were ready to pack up and leave the lake, my brother-in-law hooked into this huge lake trout. We got super excited. I tried to get the camera out to film it, and I ended up losing the GoPro. It came off the mount and fell out of my hand, and unfortunately it bounced down the hole. So we lost the GoPro, we lost all the footage. I spent about an hour trying to fish it off the bottom in about 40 feet of water with a big treble hook, and obviously, because I don't have the footage to prove, I was unsuccessful. Despite the setback, we still had an amazing trip, camping out under the northern lights, eating delicious food, snow machining, catching lots of fish, and seeing plenty of wildlife, including caribou, bald eagles, moose, and even the occasional duck swimming in the freshly thawed creek. Alright, so in this video we're going to talk about tactics, lures, baits, locations, and other gear that'll help you catch lake trout. But before we do that, we need to talk about lake trout feeding habits and get a basic understanding of how these fish live, hunt, and feed, because if we don't understand that, none of the rest of this video is really going to matter. And keep in mind that fish diets, habits, and life cycles do differ by location, so some of the stuff that I talk about in this video that works well for me here in South Central Alaska may not work very well in other parts of the world. Lake trout are a predator, and in most lakes they inhabit, they are the biggest and the baddest fish in that lake, and they are hungry. Generally, these fish are only found in very large, deep, cold lakes in the northernmost regions of the continent. And typically you'll find them roaming the deep bottoms of these lakes, usually in rocky or sandy areas as opposed to vegetated. This is an important thing to note because if you drill your hole through the ice and you're bringing up vegetation on your lure, or you're marking lots of vegetation on your sonar unit, if that's what you're using, you may not be in a great location to catch lake trout. Now that's not to say that they don't hang out in vegetated areas, because they do. They just typically don't hang out actually in the vegetation like you might find with rainbow trout, because they're not really looking to hide from anything. Like I said a second ago, they're the biggest and the baddest thing in the lake. So while they do have those natural instincts to stay near cover, you're not usually going to find them actually hiding in vegetation or even above vegetation. Usually they prefer rocky or sandy, hard or even soft bottoms as opposed to heavily vegetated bottoms, because it gives them a good area to roam and they can see prey from a long ways away and actively engage it without it hiding in anything that the lake trout has to kind of pick it out of. Now, one more thing to note about vegetation while we're on the topic is if you can find what's called a transition line where the vegetation kind of stops and then it transitions over into that rocky or sandy bottom, that can be a very good spot to target not only lake trout but other species, because species like rainbow trout or grayling or other things like that in lakes might be using that vegetation to kind of hide in, and the lake trout know that, so they'll be kind of roaming along that transition line waiting for something to come out of the weeds that they can target as prey. And rarely does a lake trout hang out in one specific location for very long. Like I said, they roam, they're predators, and they're always on the move looking for prey, and they don't just sit and hang out in one spot like you might see with a rainbow trout, for example. Now, that's not to say that they're not going to hang out in a common area. So let's think of what I like to call a point of interest, or a point where it has perfect conditions for lake trout to live. So let's think that maybe we have this big area on the bottom of a lake that's 50 yards in diameter. So that area might have perfect conditions for lake trout to live in. You know, the right type of bottom, the right oxygen levels, the right food source, maybe there's an inlet creek nearby, something like that that provides the lake trout with something that they need to live. So you have this perfect area, so chances are there is going to be lake trout in that area. But like I said, this might be a 50-yard in diameter area, so they're not going to just be sitting in one spot, just sitting there perfectly still, like you might see with a rainbow trout sitting up under a lay-down tree up on the shore waiting for a bug to swim by or something like that. They're going to be using that entire area to their advantage, and they're just going to be lurking around, kind of following the shelves and the walls of that hole, looking for prey. So the lake trout are just going to be swimming around through this area targeting their prey, which is going to work in your advantage as the fisherman. And that brings me to my first topic of patience. Patience is key in lake trout fishing. Lake trout fishing can be boring and slow, so it really is a game for the patient fisherman. You can sit out there all day long for hours and hours and only mark or catch one fish, or you might not even get a single bite at all. I've sat out on the lake for 6-7 hours and caught one fish all day, and I've been skunked a few times too. And unfortunately, that's just how it is. Lake trout are a difficult species to catch, and sometimes it happens. Don't let it get the best of you. It happens even to the best of us. So just get back out there, continue trying to target these fish, and eventually you will figure out how to catch them. Now, going back to how these fish just roam around the depths in these, kind of select perfect areas, that's going to help you as the fisherman. And the reason for that is if you set up on a spot, let's say you've gone 2 hours and you haven't marked a fish, as long as you're in one of those kind of prime real estate lake trout zones, chances are eventually, because these fish roam looking for their prey, eventually one is probably going to swim by where you're at. It just takes time and patience to wait for that fish to swim by. So I've mentioned these prime areas a couple times now, and that's the next thing that we're going to talk about is location. Where can you put yourself to get yourself into that prime location to target lake trout? Now, I've mentioned these prime lake trout condition areas a couple times now, and that's the next thing that I'm going to talk about, where to specifically target these fish to get yourself into that prime area, or at least an area that eventually one of them might swim by. So maybe it's not the perfect area per se, but it's an area that they are likely to still come through, maybe transitioning between those perfect areas or something like that. Like I said before, trout typically cruise around in deeper depths, but are sometimes found shallower. This can vary widely depending on location, time of year, time of day, type of prey they're hunting and feeding on, where that prey is, atmospherical pressure, and so many other factors that this can become very overwhelming to a person who is new to lake trout fishing. And to make matters worse, lakers are usually found in huge bodies of water like Lake Superior, Lake George, Lake Louise, places like those. So where do you even begin? So there are 3 basic tools that I typically use to kind of pick out where I'm going to fish for lake trout. And I usually do this before I even actually get to the lake. I usually do it that morning or even the night before and kind of pre-plan my spots so I know what I'm doing and I don't waste any time when I get out to the water. The first tool that I want to talk about is free for everybody to use. Everybody already knows it, and it's Google Earth. Google Earth doesn't give you a ton of info. You don't get to see things like depth or, temperatures or anything like that. But what it does give you is you can actually look at it, and depending on when it was photographed, if it was the summer or the winter time, you can actually see differences in the shades of blue in the water, indicating underwater structure that might be shallow under the surface. And then, obviously dark blue water is going to be where it gets deeper. So if you see super light blue water and then super dark blue water right next to each other, there's a likely chance that there's a pretty good drop off right there, and that might be a good location to target lake trout. So if you don't have access to any of these other tools that I talk about next, just doing that can sometimes get you onto a perfect spot. This image here that I screenshotted from Google Earth is the best example that I have to show you guys how Google Earth works when I'm out on the water. As you can see, we have a sharp point that sticks out into the water. While you can't see it while you're actually on the lake, that point continues well into the lake underwater, indicated by the shallow marks that you can see about in the center of the screen, extending to both the right and left at the bottom. As you look towards the left of the screen, the water turns much dark blue, indicating that it is much deeper. You can also see on the right side of the screen that there is an inlet creek that flows into the lake just off the bottom of the screen. This is a prime example of a very good spot, and this is actually where I caught that 34-inch lake trout that I showed you at the beginning of the video. This example here is of Anderson Lake in the Matanuska-Susitna Valley. While this lake does not contain any lake trout, it is a good example to look at on Google Earth because you can see the many different shades of water indicating different depths. In this particular case, the bottom of this lake here in these very shallow parts is actually very weedy, which can be indicated on Google Earth by the green color of the water. This next example here is also Anderson Lake in the Matanuska-Susitna Valley, and while it's kind of difficult to see, that part that I have circled is actually a very shallow island in the middle of the lake that comes up to about 3 feet under the water and drops to about 15 feet on either side. I confirmed this one last summer by scouting it out in my kayak. And like I said, Google Earth doesn't give you any depth info or anything like that, but it is still a very useful tool to get you on the right track or even close. One other cool thing that you can do with Google Earth is if you turn your location services on your mobile device, you can track your location on the app. So if you're snow machining or hiking into a spot that you've selected before going out onto the lake, you can actually look at that and kind of use it sort of like a GPS to get yourself to where you want to be, or close to it, as long as you have cell service. And that's the only downfall with it, is you have to have cell service to use Google Earth. So unfortunately, if you're out on the lake and you're remote and you don't have any service, it might not be a tool that you're able to use. The next tool that I typically use is also free to everybody and can be pretty useful up to a point. This is an example of a bathymetric map provided by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, or ADF&G. Basically what this map is it gives you a very general profile of what the bottom of the lake looks like in certain areas. It is nowhere near exact and it's very, very broad, but it does give you a general idea, which can help you out if you don't have any other tools available to you. These maps are very, very easy to read and understand. The lines that you see in the middle of the lake are different depths indicated by the numbers next to them. Usually these maps have private property listed, which is that gray area that you see around the lake, public recreation areas and accesses, which are the 2 campgrounds that you see on the right side of the screen, and roads and various inlet and outlet creeks around the lake. Most lakes here in Alaska have maps like this, and they can be very easy to find by searching the name of the lake followed by the words bathymetric map in your internet search.
Usually the very first option will be the ADF&G page, which you click on and it will pull up this map. As you can see here in this screen recording that I took, you can zoom in on the map and get a better idea of where you are on the lake and what depth you might be at. You can also see inlet and outlet creeks, as I mentioned a minute ago, private property, and the public accesses where you can go out onto the lake.
These maps very roughly depict the bottom of the lake and give you a general idea of what depth you might be at or might be close to. One thing that I like to do is I'll put these maps up side by side with Google Earth, and by doing that, I can actually look at the bathymetric map on the ADF&G page, and then look at Google Earth next to it with the location services turned on, and I can use Google Earth to kind of walk to the spot on the ADF&G map where it might be 50 feet deep or something like that, just for an example. So it can be rather useful. The only downfall to these is, again, you have to have cell service to access them unless you pre-download them before you go out of cell service, which is what I usually like to do. So that is kind of a downfall. The other downfall is they're not super accurate. Obviously, there isn't a lot of contour to them. It just gives you a general idea. So, you could walk out to the middle of the lake and know that you're probably in 60 feet of water, for example. But if you're on like a very steep drop off, there isn't a lot of context there. So you could be in 20 feet of water, you could be in 50 feet of water. You don't really know, unfortunately. And the final tool that I like to use, in my opinion, is the most important, and it's the most useful tool that I use to locate lake trout. The Navionics boating app is an incredible tool that provides you with incredibly detailed maps of the lake bottom and gives you an exact depth, as well as weather info, waypoint options, and so much more. The best part about Navionics is that it takes your location using GPS rather than cell service. So even if you're out in a remote area, completely out of cell service, you can always still access your real-time maps, locations, and waypoints. The app costs $15 a year, which isn't all that much, and in my opinion is completely worth it. It also offers you a free trial that you can use, and that way you can decide if you like it and want to pay the $15 or not. So that's pretty cool too. This app has put me on almost every single spot that I've caught lake trout at this past winter season through the ice, and I highly recommend purchasing it. It's completely worth it and the best one out there. Okay, so now you know what to use to find a potential spot, but how do you know what you are looking at? Well, I'm glad that you asked. Typically, when I look at the map of a lake while pre-planning my trip, I'm looking for those points of interest that I mentioned earlier. Those points of interest for targeting lake trout are usually areas that are different or have something unique, like that underwater point or island that I showed you earlier, or maybe a sharp, steep drop, or even an inside turn forming a type of bowl. Lake trout use structure like this to chase and corner bait fish, and you are far more likely to find them here rather than in the middle of some huge flat or something like that.
In my experience, the best spots are a deep point off the end of an island, kind of like this one, at the bottom of a sharp drop coming off of the island. A deep bowl that comes up very shallow on 3 or 4 sides. The deep section at the mouth of an inlet or an outlet creek. Just off a shallow underwater point that drops off into deeper water. Or a small flat, or what I like to call a shelf, like this, that separates two downward sloping, steep sections of the lake, kind of like a stair step.
Okay, so now you've pre-selected your potential spots. I usually like to find several just in case one or a couple don't work out. That way I have some kind of backup plan. Anyway, you've selected your spots and you're out on the ice and you've drilled some holes. At this point, you have the option to use a couple more tools to verify your depth, although it's not really necessary. Electronics just simply make lake trout fishing a whole lot easier for many reasons, but right now we're just going to focus on the depth aspect of using a fish finder, a flasher, an aqua-view camera, something like that. So these tools can really help you pinpoint that perfect spot without having to drill 20 test holes and hand feed line down every single hole, measuring it foot by foot to figure out what depth you're at. Simply drill your hole, drop your transducer down there, and that's going to tell you immediately and digitally right there on the screen what depth that you're at. I use the Garmin Striker 4 portable kit. It's my absolute favorite fish finder. I'll show you guys it here in a little while. Later in the video, I'm gonna kind of go over just a couple basics of using the Garmin Striker 4 that can help you target these fish. But for now, all I'm going to leave you with is the Garmin Striker 4 is the best budget fish finder, and for under $200, you cannot beat it. I highly recommend purchasing one if you have the funds available, as it will drastically increase your odds of catching lake trout. So if you're using these tools, once you have your holes drilled, like I was talking about a second ago, instead of drilling 20 tester holes and hand feeding line to check your depth, you can drill one hole, you can drop your transducer down, it's going to digitally tell you the depth that you're at, and then if let's say you're at 20 feet and there's a hole next to it that you're trying to get into that's 50 feet deep, but you're only at 20 feet right now. At that point, I like to bring up my Navionics app, or even the bathymetric ADF&G map, even though it's not as accurate. And I can look at that map and I can say, all right, so I'm right here, but I need to be 20 feet to my left, and that's probably where I'm gonna hit that 50-foot mark. So now rather than just drilling holes in like 5-foot increments and measuring every single one, you can drill that one hole and go, yep, I need to move 20 feet that direction, hop over, drill another hole, drop your depth finder down again. Guess what? Now you're right at 50 feet, and you did it in 2 holes rather than drilling 20. So it's an extremely useful tool. Like I said, you don't have to have it. You can drill 20 test holes, hand feed your line down, figure out what depth you're at that way. It just takes much longer and it's just not as accurate. But if you're new to lake trout fishing and don't have the funds to purchase a Fishfinder setup, you definitely can do it that way. I'm not saying you can't, so don't let the Fishfinder thing deter you. I just wanted to give you guys an idea of another option that you can use. Now, going back to what I said earlier about how it can be very overwhelming for new fishermen to try to find a spot to target lake trout on some huge lake. I mean, Lake Louise, where I've been going the past couple weeks, for example, is like 7 miles long and 5 miles wide or something like that. I mean, it's a huge body of water. So just looking at a map of that lake as a new fisherman, can be very overwhelming because there's just so much area to cover that those fish could possibly be. But by using the tactics that I just told you about, using those apps and the maps and the Navionics and all that kind of stuff, and a fish finder if you have it available, now you've narrowed that area down and you've made it so much more manageable and easier for you to locate a potential spot. Essentially, you can now just take a quick glance at the map of a lake and immediately filter out all of the spots that don't matter, which is usually like well over half the lake. So now, rather than having this huge map of this huge lake, you've now narrowed it down to this small little map, and then you can look at that, easily pick out like, oh, there's an underwater island, there's a little channel that's 50 feet deep separating 2 islands, there's a little point, something like that. And now you've narrowed it down even smaller, and maybe you have 20 points of interest that you've selected, and from those I like to pick what's going to be the best. What is my top 3? So I'll look at those 20 points of interest, filter out the ones that I don't think are going to be as good, and then I'm left with my 3 major points of interest, and the next day when I get out to the lake, that's exactly where I go, and usually I have pretty good luck doing that. So that's what I recommend doing. It's going to drastically increase your odds of finding these fish much faster and easier, and it's going to help you catch more fish. A couple final points that I want to touch on in the location field before we move on are concerning depths to fish at. Now, like I said, lakers usually prefer deeper, colder water, but this is not to say that they'll never be found shallow, because they sometimes will. It all depends on many different factors, such as where their prey is, time of day, time of year, oxygen levels in the water, atmospheric pressure, and so on. All of this can be very overwhelming to a beginner, so the best advice that I have for this, while many factors can affect what depth these fish are at, the best luck that I've had time and time again, whether it be at Lake Louise or Long Lake or any other lake trout lake, is 35 to 40 feet is usually the prime lake trout zone, as long as you're in one of those points of interest that we discussed a few minutes ago. Obviously this changes, but as a general rule of thumb for a beginner, I always recommend 35 to 40 feet. And usually all the people that I have had message me asking about how to fish for lake trout, this advice usually pays off. I've had a lot of them message me back pictures of them holding their big lake trout, thanking me for the advice. So like I said, 35 to 40 feet is my go-to that I always recommend to people. That's always what I start at. When I get to a lake, 35 to 40 feet, that's my go-to, and it usually pays off. To jump just a little bit deeper into it is what I usually find is that this is a good depth to start the morning at. Like I said, when I show up to a lake, 35 to 40 feet, right what I go to. Because the fish often tend to move a bit shallower to feed in the mornings and the evenings. And then midday, the water temperature starts rising, the sun's beating down on the ice. Fish will tend to go deeper midday. Not always, but they tend to. So I usually start in the morning, 35, 40, 45 feet, somewhere in there. And then midday, I'll go down. I've had luck all the way down to 60 feet in Long Lake, for example. There's a big flat that's 60 feet deep, so I'll fish right up against the walls of that midday, and I've had pretty good luck doing that. Additionally, barometric pressure associated with the weather can heavily affect these fish. What people usually consider the best trout fishing pressure is between 29.7 and 30.4, as the internet told me. I looked it up, of course. Usually lower pressure is associated with worse weather, such as rain or snow or even overcast skies, that typically cause the fish to go deeper and slow their feeding down. So the bite might not be as good in a low pressure, poor weather situation as it might be on a nice sunny day where the pressure is higher. Normal or high pressure is usually considered better for trout fishing and is usually found on nicer days weather-wise. Again, this is not always exact in any way, but while it is a little bit more advanced, it is good to learn about and check on a weather app before planning an outing. In short, if the pressure is lower, try deeper, and if it's higher, try shallower. I generally still will start 35 to 40 feet and work my way shallower, deeper from there. If what you're doing isn't producing fish, try something else. That's the most important advice that I can give you in this whole thing. If what you are doing isn't working, try something else. Usually I'll start with a simple change of lure. I'll change lures 3 or 4 or 5 times or whatever. If that doesn't work, I'll try shallower, I'll try deeper, because that becomes a little more difficult. You have to drill more holes, maybe move your tent, that kind of thing. And then my third option is the hardest of the options, which is obviously going to be completely move spots to a whole other area of the lake. But going back to the depth thing, 35 to 40, and then move shallower or deeper from there. If the pressure is lower, move deeper. If it's higher, move shallower. Okay, so now you're an expert and you know everything that you need to know about location and how to put yourself on a spot where you can target lake trout effectively. So the next thing that we're going to need to talk about is the gear that you're going to need to use to target lake trout, because this gear is much different than the gear needed to target other species. Lake trout are large, heavy fish that fight very aggressively, often for long periods of time before you can even get them onto the ice. That is, if your gear doesn't fail you first. So let's talk specifically about rod setup, and then we can move into baits and lures after that. Ideally, you're going to want to use a rod that's a bit heavier duty than a rod that you would use to target most smaller or less aggressive species. And keep in mind that this preference does differ widely amongst fishermen, so I'm going to show you specifically what I prefer to use, and then you can make the choice for yourself once you get out there, test some stuff out, and kind of figure out what you're doing. So both the rods that I use are medium heavy rods. I prefer medium heavy for lake trout fishing as it provides the needed strength to fight a 15-pound fish for 10 minutes or more, without sacrificing all of its flexibility needed to absorb the huge head shakes that could pop the hook out of the fish's mouth at any time. Okay, the first rod that I'm going to show you today is my Shakespeare medium heavy 36-inch Wild Series. I really like this rod. It's medium heavy, so it's got that nice stiff backbone, but as you progress down towards the tip, it's nice and soft. So that's kind of what I was talking about with the medium heavy action, is when you're fighting a fish, you've got this nice stiff backbone so you can really get a grip and kind of wrestle that fish up to the surface. But down here, it's nice and soft, so when that fish starts shaking its head violently, it's not going to pop the hook out of its mouth. And as you can see, this is a traditional spinning reel like most people are probably used to using on most of their fishing rods. So this is a fairly cheap rod, and while not quite the bottom of the barrel, a rod like this is still very affordable to most people. Yet it gives you the qualities that you need to effectively fight a large fish like a lake trout. This next rod that I'm going to show you is actually my main rod that I use for lake trout fishing. I really love this rod. I built it probably 2 months ago now, and this is actually the rod that I used when I caught that 34-inch fish that I showed you at the beginning of the video. So this is the Lost Creek 45-inch medium heavy. This is actually Sportsman's Warehouse brand, and it's a really great rod. It's a bait casting setup, as you can see, and I've got that paired with the loose speed spool LFS. So there are obviously some big differences between this rod and the rod that I just showed you. So let's take a look at this setup and kind of go over what's going on here, and then I'll show you why I prefer it for larger fish. So first of all, the rod itself is obviously much longer here at 45 inches. I really like this because there is a lot more rod here to help absorb the fish fighting and thrashing, which really helps prevent the hook from popping out of the fish. The rod also includes a nice fighting butt. This fighting butt is really nice because, as you can see with my hand sitting in the position that I'd be fighting a fish in, the butt kind of sits up under my forearm here, which prevents the rod from slipping and falling down towards the hole like that. And it really gives you a nice firm grip. Also, you have the traditional bait casting trigger grip here, which is just another added bonus. It helps the rod stay nice and firm in your hand. It helps you manage this reel, and it prevents the rod from suddenly slipping out of your hand if the fish starts to pull really aggressively. While this long of a rod can sometimes be inconvenient in a tight space like a small ice tent, I used a Quick Fish 3, and sometimes, depending on where I drill my hole in the tent, this long of a rod can be kind of cumbersome, but the benefits of this rod far outweigh that one minor inconvenience. Now let's take a look at the reel that I have on this rod. When most people think of a baitcaster reel, they think that it can only be good for what the name suggests, casting, but that is not the case. Baitcasting reels actually work very well for ice fishing applications as well, and have become my preferred type of reel specifically for lake trout. In my opinion, the drag system is a lot smoother, and overall this type of reel handles the large fish a whole lot better. The main reason that I like baitcasters, however, is the ease of dropping lures to the bottom and knowing exactly where you're at. With spinning reels, oftentimes the ice built up on the line or reel itself can prevent the line from easily coming off of the reel. This is really frustrating when you're trying to lower a line 60, 70, 80, even 100 feet down to the bottom of a lake, and you're having to manually strip the line off the reel, especially if you have a fish marked on the Fishfinder and you need to quickly get down to the depth. Additionally, baitcasters have a braking system built in that, if fine-tuned correctly, stops the spool as soon as the lure touches the water, or in this case, the bottom of the lake. This eliminates the guesswork of, am I actually on the bottom, or is it just hung up on the reel somewhere? So from this angle here, you should be able to see the reel a whole lot better and kind of get an idea of what I'm talking about. When I open up the reel, that's going to allow the bait to free fall, and as soon as it hits the bottom of the lake, or in this case, my kitchen floor, this is going to stop spinning and letting line out, and that's what's going to tell me that that lure is now on the bottom. So we'll go ahead and open the bail here. That lure is now on the bottom and the reel has stopped spinning. So that's what's going to let me know that that lure is on the bottom. I can go ahead and close the reel, and now we're ready to start fishing for lake trout. Tuning your bait casting reel for ice fishing is actually very simple. You're going to simply turn this knob over here to increase or decrease the friction on the reel as it lets line out. And this is dependent on the weight of the lure or the jig that you are using. You're going to want to adjust this every single time that you switch lures to make sure that it's tuned to the correct weight. What you're looking for is, as soon as that lure hits the ground, your spool should stop turning. So in this case, my lure hits the ground, it immediately stops. The reason for that is if the spool continues spooling, it's what's called overspool, and it can wrap itself up. So notice how if I loosen up the adjustment over here just a little bit, when that lure hits the floor, the reel continued spooling and it actually sucked the line back underneath it, and that can actually cause a bird's nest and get you all tangled up. Additionally, in my experience, baitcasters have way less line memory issues, and they're a lot less likely to just kind of coil off of your reel, kind of like a slinky, like spinning reels do. You guys know what I'm talking about, where the line just kind of randomly just slinkies off. That's usually attributed to crappy line quality, but it can happen even with the best of lines in certain conditions, and you just don't get that issue with the baitcaster because everything is contained. The line literally cannot come off of the reel unless it's being pulled off from the front. The only issue that baitcasters have is there's a minimum weight requirement of the lure that you can put on the end of the line for the reel to actually work. And what I mean by that is the line coming off of a baitcaster reel is all by gravity. There's no bail that you just open and the line just kind of free flows off the reel like you have with a spinning reel. On the baitcaster, the weight of the lure is actually what is peeling the line off of this reel. So if the lure doesn't weigh enough, there's not enough gravitational force from the lure dropping off the end of the rod to actually strip this line out of the reel. So that's the only downfall to them. But in most cases for lake trout fishing, you're going to be using, 1/3 ounce, 1/2 ounce, 3/4 ounce, ounce lures, and that's plenty of weight to peel the line off of a bait casting reel. Once you have the baitcaster all figured out, I find that it's so much more enjoyable to use and has so much more functionality than a traditional spinning reel. You might not prefer it, I do, and of course it's all personal preference, so at least give it a try if you have the funding available. Maybe you'll like it, maybe you won't, but at least you tried it. Most people that I lend my rod and reel for a quick second so they can try it out really prefer it over a traditional spinning rod. So going back to the line memory issue that I just talked about, where you can kind of have your line slinky off the end of your spinning reel, that's what we're going to talk about next. What line should you use when lake trout fishing to ensure that you have a good sturdy line that's not going to break under pressure while you're fighting a large fish. Get yourself a good, heavy, and strong main line. I prefer to use braid, and more specifically, I really like this Power Pro V2 Super Slick, and this is in the 15-pound variety. You can certainly go heavier than 15-pound, and most guys actually do. Most videos that I see on YouTube, a lot of guys are even running up to like 80-pound test if they're using braid on their reel, and that's totally fine. I just particularly like this 15-pound, and I find that it works really, really well in this particular reel. I also use this reel for casting in the summertime on my casting rod, and it's nice to not have to switch back and forth. And really, 15-pound test is all that I need for lake trout fishing specifically. Most of the lake trout lakes nearby that I frequent don't have that large a lake trout in them. You might be lucky to find a 15-pound fish once in a while, so really 15-pound or less is usually going to be fine for me. But if you're fishing lakes that consistently have large fish, like trophy-sized fish, like 20-pound plus, you're probably going to want to go with a much heavier main line. I really like this Power Pro V2 Super Slick though, because as the name suggests, it's super slick and it doesn't hang up very easily. It glides right through your reel and line guides, and I find that it even helps prevent ice buildup when fishing outside the tent. You can definitely also use mono or fluorocarbon, but I just recommend no matter what you use, spend just a little bit of extra money and get the good quality line. This will save you some frustration later when that line snaps off and you lose a fish because you bought poor quality line. Then on the end of my main line, but before the lure, I always run a leader. So as you can see here, peel this off, there's my Power Pro V2 Super Slick, and right here you can see I've got a knot and it transitions over to my leader. Lake trout are excellent predators and can tell when something is off. Presentation really matters with these fish. They can easily see your line and it may deter them from striking at your lure. First, make sure your leader is long enough to put good separation between your main line and your lure. I usually prefer 8 to 10 foot leader. You can definitely go more and you can even go less. Sometimes maybe 4 or 6 foot is going to be more appropriate for the depth that you're fishing, but usually I'm fishing 35, 40, 50 feet and so on. So a nice 8 to 10 foot leader is going to give me a good advantage so that lake trout can't see it at the bottom of the lake. When attaching your leader to your main line, make sure you use a good knot that won't give under pressure. Most people use an Albright or a Palomar knot, often with a swivel between the two. For leader material, fluorocarbon is usually the best as it's the hardest for fish to see because of the way that the light shines through it. And I usually like to use 14 or 15-pound test for my leaders. Again, it's going to differ where you are most likely, so use what you feel comfortable with. If you're consistently catching or seeing large fish coming out of a body of water that you're fishing, probably going to be a better idea to use a heavier test leader. Just keep in mind, the thicker that leader is, the more likely it is for the fish to see it. And one last tip about the line that you use is having good line really can affect how your reel performs, especially if you're using a bait caster. Poor quality line can tangle in a bait caster before you even realize what's happened, so always keep that in mind. The $2 roll of store brand mono that you got down at Walmart may not work very well for you or your reel. Okay, so now the fun begins. Let's talk about lures and baits. Before we get into this, make sure to always check your rules and regulations for the areas that you're fishing, as sometimes baits, multiple hook lures, treble hooks, and so on can be prohibited in certain bodies of water or at certain times of year. So here in front of me, I have my all-time favorite lake trout lures that I've had fantastic luck with time and time again. So let's take a look at what I have here. So my all-time favorite lake trout fishing lure that I always use is the good old traditional tube jig. These are a type of soft plastic that's heated, poured into a mold, cooled, and this is what you get. You can buy these jig heads as separate pieces and then assemble them yourself, which is usually the cheapest way to do it. So as you can see here, I've got just some blank lead jig heads, and then I've got just some blank tubes with no hook or anything in them. And like I said, that's usually the cheapest way to do it because you can buy them in huge packs like this. Here I've got some of the glow-in-the-dark traditional white, and then I've got the chartreuse with the nice sparklies in there, just like that. You can also buy them pre-assembled like this one here, where when you buy them, they're usually individual or in packs of 2 or even 3 sometimes, and they come with the tube already put onto the hook, just like that. While the pre-assembled ones like this can be more convenient, they're usually a lot more expensive, and you're usually paying upwards of $4 or $5 for just one of these setups. Most tube jigs are simple like these ones here, where it's just a simple tube over a hook, but some companies make more elaborate ones like this one here. This tube jig is from Columbia River, which is a company local here to Palmer, Alaska. These ones here have these free moving fins on the side that kind of flap up and down and make a jingling noise as you jig it through the water, which just kind of gives it that much more realistic look to it. And it also has that nice jingling noise, which can help draw in curious lake trout. Typically, I prefer tubes of this size here, even for the larger lake trout, as they're really willing to gulp down pretty much anything, including larger prey. However, on lakes where the lake trout are usually smaller, I may downsize accordingly and use something like this one here. Again, in my opinion, these type of jigs are the most effective for lake trout and become 10 times more deadly when tipped with some kind of bait. I usually prefer whitefish or herring, but this may differ depending on your region where you are. To do this, simply cut a nice sturdy piece of the flesh from the bait fish off and then insert it through the skin over the hook. And I like to bring it all the way down and kind of spread the skirt on this nice and wide and put it right in the middle and then close the skirt around it just to keep it looking kind of realistic so there's not just a huge chunk of flesh kind of hanging off the back up here. The scent of that bait paired with the jigging tactic that we'll talk about in just a minute is irresistible to lake trout, and they'll strike at it nearly every time. The next lure that we're going to talk about that you can use with amazing results is the spoon lure. This is an example of what I like to use specifically, and this is made by Kodiak Customs here in Alaska, but there are tons and tons of different options out there to choose from. I find that a size like this works very well on fish of all sizes, and I like these darker natural colors rather than something that appears abnormal to the fish. While abnormal can draw them in because they're curious, they're not as likely to strike a weird, unnatural color as they are to strike a nice natural color like these here. This nice natural darker color here in Alaska could imitate like a small grayling or maybe even a rainbow trout or a coho salmon or something like that that lake trout are used to seeing in the waters and they're used to regularly feeding on. My advice on spoons is not to get spoons that are too heavy. Remember, you're not casting these lures and you don't need a ton of weight. Get something lighter that kind of slowly flutters down through the water because this is supposed to imitate an injured and dying bait fish. And a spoon that just drops straight down like a rock doesn't really look natural to a hungry lake trout. Again, presentation is key to induce a strike in most cases. The next lure that I want to talk about is absolutely deadly on lake trout, and this is a Berkeley rattlebait. So this is a hard plastic lure that looks like a small fish, has the eye on top of it so it jigs perfectly straight up and down in the water, and it has a really cool rattle inside, so it gives off tons of noise and vibration, and when you jig this thing up through the water, it actually swims side to side just like that. So you've got tons of noise and vibrations to draw fish in. And even more awesome, these baits have two places that you can put a hook on it. So in places that you're allowed to use double hooks or double treble hooks or something like that, it's even more deadly and you can get hookups even easier. Additionally, jigging rapalas work very similar to that rattle bait that I just showed you, and basically all this is it's a nice metal heavy jig that has a tail that causes it to kind of swim back and forth through the water as you jig it up and down, and it has a set hook on each end of it. So really you have 3 hook options on these, so no matter which way the fish takes it from, you're likely to get a good hook set. The only problem with these is in a lot of places having this many hooks on a single lure is prohibited. So make sure that you can use this before you use this on any body of water. Now that we've discussed artificial lures, let's talk about bait, because a lot of people prefer to use bait over artificial lures. Usually the best type of bait for lake trout is something that imitates something that they're used to actually seeing and feeding on. So usually, at least up here, that's going to be a small white flesh fish, like a whitefish, grayling, rainbow trout, something like that. This obviously differs by location and what fish in specific lakes are used to seeing. I've heard of people trying to use store-bought shrimp, and in my experience, lake trout don't really seem interested in it. And I think this is because they're not used to naturally seeing it. Like I said, what they're used to naturally seeing is going to be small white-fleshed fish, so that's the best thing to use. The easiest way to use bait is to cut a nice chunk of it with lots of skin so the meat is firmly held together, and then I like to put it on a large octopus hook with a little bit of weight a couple feet above it. That way the lake trout doesn't see the weight and focus in on that. You can jig it or dead stick it like this, or even put it on a jaw jacker, and usually either of those methods work perfectly fine. My preferred method to fish bait, other than tipping my jigs with it, is actually to use what's called a quick strike rig, which I have right here. Quick strike rigs are a wire with a treble hook on either end of it, and then it's got this connector loop in the middle, and this is actually where your line will attach up here. Typically you'll take a whole herring or a similar bait fish like that, and you'll insert one of these hooks through the snout of the fish, and you'll insert the other one through the tail. Then you lower it down and you'll just rest this on the bottom. Reel the slack in, and then you can leave your bail open or close it and turn your drag extremely loose so you can hear it when the line starts peeling off. What will happen is a lake trout will swim by, see the bait sitting on the bottom, and it'll actually eat it off of the bottom. At this point, you'll see the line start peeling off of your reel as the fish swims away with the bait in its mouth. At this point, you still want to wait and you don't want to try to set that hook yet. You want the trout to get the bait far enough into its mouth so when you do set the hook, you get a good hook set nice and deep in the mouth so you don't lose the fish. So wait a minute and then close your bail or tighten your drag very fast and go ahead and set that hook. This method can be a bit slower than using another method, but it works very well. I like to use quick strike rigs on a dead stick while I jig another hole on lakes where 2 lines are allowed. One final piece of gear that I want to discuss real quick before moving on to jigging method is this thing right here. And what this is it's a water activated green light that blinks very brightly when submerged underneath the water. Essentially, it's just a swivel on either end that's tied in line above your lure. I usually like to tie it about 1.5 to 2 feet above my lure, and it works very well at attracting curious fish. And these work especially well in times that you're not allowed to use bait because it still gives you some form of attractant on your line. As you can see, my hand is just a little bit sweaty on my fingertip there, and it's actually activating that light. There's these 2 little prongs on the back, and when they get submerged into water, they'll start flashing just like that. All right, so we've talked about lures and baits, but just as important is how you use those lures and baits. Jigging works great for attracting trout in, and if they're hungry enough, they will hit it as is. But simply jigging doesn't always seal the deal for a more suspicious fish. I've had trout examine my lure for an eternity before they strike, if they ever do at all. Sometimes you'll watch them on the Fishfinder circle in and out of view forever and then just leave. My 34-inch personal best took about 20 minutes to finally commit to my tube jig. They are careful, suspicious fish, and it really takes a good presentation and technique to trick them into striking. They may swim over and check out a jig that's just bobbing up and down over and over and over because they're very curious fish, but they might not touch it. So let's talk about the important adjustment that you need to make to your technique if you're continuously marking fish that just never strike. Lake trout in most areas feed near the bottom or literally on the bottom of the lake. Here in Alaska, it's very rare, at least in my experience, for a lake trout to chase your jig more than 10 or 15 feet up off the bottom, ascending towards the surface. These fish here in Alaska are looking to feed on injured bait fish that provide an easy meal for them. That means that the trout almost exclusively feeds near the bottom as dying prey falls towards the bottom, or it'll actually feed off the bottom after that prey has already died and is laying on the bottom. Every single lake trout that I have ever caught has been within 5 to 10 feet of the bottom as the jig drops on the fall, or off the actual bottom after I've dropped it and the jig is resting in the dirt, and then I went to lift it back up and there was a whole bunch of weight on the line because the lake trout actually took it off the bottom. This method that I use, in my opinion, best imitates an injured or dying bait fish as it's sinking towards the bottom, and then maybe as it's sinking, it thrashes real quick and kind of bobs back up, and then maybe it settles on the bottom as it's dying. And as it's desperately trying to hold on to life and continue swimming, it kind of keeps following that tactic where it bounces back up and then it just can't maintain itself and it sinks back down to the bottom, keeps thrashing around. And that's kind of what we're looking to imitate, because that's what these lake trout are looking for, is that injured and dying fish, because it provides that easy meal for them. So typically I like to start by jigging in very long, steady, even strokes about 5 feet off the bottom, upward to maybe about 8 to 10 feet off the bottom. This is another reason that I prefer a nice long rod, because it can give you those really long strokes just from the tip of the rod moving up and down rather than moving your entire arm up and down, which will burn your shoulder out pretty quick. So I'll do that same motion for maybe a minute or two, and then I'll actually open my reel and let the lure drop and settle on the bottom, and I'll just let it rest there for a few seconds. While it rests, just keep enough tension in the line to where if something touches the lure, you can feel it, but you're not actually holding the lure up off the bottom. You want to make sure that it's sitting right on the bottom of the lake. After a few seconds, raise it back up into the previous zone and continue jigging again. Repeat this process over and over. Occasionally, if I haven't marked a fish in a while, I like to actually reel my lure all the way up to the surface right under the ice, and then I'll re-drop it to the bottom, and then continue jigging and resting it on the bottom and just kind of continue that process. Raising the lure all the way to the surface and re-dropping it gives a chance to the fish that are further away, maybe like 100 feet away, to see that lure falling from right under the ice, Whereas if you were just jigging on the bottom the entire time, maybe fish that are 100 feet away can't see it because there's a rock there, or there's vegetation that's kind of obscuring it, or a drop where they can't see it because they're above the drop and it's down below, something like that. So it just gives those fish that are further out a chance to kind of see your lure where they might not have seen it before. And then usually they'll come over real quick and investigate your lure. Using this tactic is very important as it gets the fish excited and, if done correctly, appears to the trout as natural rather than a foreign object just kind of bobbing up and down in the water because they're like, oh, what is that? But if it appears natural, it looks like a bait fish and they're used to seeing that, and most likely they're going to strike at it. I use this tactic on all the lures that I discussed earlier, and also if I'm using bait on a jigging style setup, and it usually works very, very well. Like I said earlier, lake trout can be very, very picky eaters, and unless they are starving, they may sometimes take a few minutes to commit to your jig, even if you're doing everything right. Don't let that deter you, and always keep working that fish. Most of the time, you can encourage a strike if you're using this tactic. As I said a minute ago, my personal best 34-inch lake trout circled in and out of view in my Fishfinder, examining my tube jig for over 20 minutes before aggressively charging and striking the lure out of nowhere. And all that time, I was just kind of doing my rhythm, just exactly what we just talked about, jigging up and down, hitting the bottom once in a while, reeling it back up, redropping it, and that kind of stuff. And eventually, it enticed that fish to finally hit it after about 20 minutes. Now, this isn't to say that after 10 to 20 minutes of marking a fish without a strike, you shouldn't maybe try a different colored jig or something like that, but even if you do pull a super fast jig swap, keep following the process and don't give up, and eventually that fish will most likely strike. In my experience, that fish will finally hit that jig after he's been examining it for a few minutes. Maybe you've marked him on the sonar for 10 minutes now, and he's just been kind of looking at it, swimming away, coming back, checking it out. And finally, after getting that real good look at it, you're gonna drop the lure onto the bottom. You're gonna let it rest there for maybe 5 seconds, and then when you go to lift back up, all of a sudden there's all kind of weight on the line that wasn't there before. That's because that fish has been checking it out, and finally it looks like that bait fish has fluttered down and died and it's resting on the bottom, and that's an easy meal for that lake trout. So now he's gonna swoop in, grab it off the bottom, and then when you go to lift back up, all of a sudden that fish is on your line, and now it's time to get that hook set. So this video is kind of getting long, so I'm gonna try to wrap it up soon, but before I do that, I'd like to quickly cover a few last points. We're gonna cover how to get a good hook set on a lake trout, how to effectively fight it and land it on the ice, and we're gonna go over how to handle it delicately and release it safely, as these fish are precious natural resources that can be very easily overfished and have their populations depleted. Then very briefly after that, we're gonna touch on a couple of functions that you can use on your Fishfinder to help you target these fish, and that's gonna wrap it up for the video. So a good hook set is crucial for successfully landing a lake trout, as you're usually in for a good hard fight and the hook can easily be dislodged from the fish's mouth if set poorly. I see a lot of people setting the hook very, very aggressively and just kind of sharply jerking it up like that as soon as they feel something on the line. And while sometimes that may work, it's not usually going to be the best choice. The two biggest issues that you have with sharply jerking that line up trying to set it are yanking the lure right out of the fish's mouth. So if the fish hasn't actually closed its mouth around the lure and it just kind of nudged it with its nose or something like that before actually committing, you're just going to yank that lure away from the fish, and usually that's probably going to spook the fish and it's not going to come back and try again. The second issue that you're going to have with trying to set a hook that aggressively is you might set the hook, but it's most likely going to continue tearing through the fish's mouth until it's holding on to maybe just the lip of the fish by not that much skin, which means that when that fish starts really head shaking and getting aggressive as you're reeling it up through the water column, that hook is likely to finally break through that fish's lip and you're going to lose that fish. Instead, what I like to do is lift the rod forcefully but steadily, as high as you can, all in one smooth motion when you feel a fish hit, rather than just jerking the rod upward sharply. It really helps if you try to fish with your tip a lot lower and closer to the hole, so you have plenty of room to move upwards. Usually, like we discussed, the fish is going to hit on the drop or while it's on the bottom. This means that the typical hookup will occur when you're actually on the downward leg of your jigging stroke, getting to the bottom, and you're going to jig back up again, and suddenly there's going to be weight on the line. At this point, it is as easy as simply continuing your upward stroke a little bit more forcefully and going as high as you possibly can to get that hook set. This is also why it's very important to make sure that your drag is nice and tight and ready to go, because that fish is going to strike when you're least expecting it, and if your drag is too loose, you're going to do that upward motion to set the hook, and your line is just going to pull off of your reel rather than forcefully setting that hook into the fish. Once you're hooked up, you need to know how to fight the fish and how to successfully land it on the ice, because one wrong move could easily cost you that trophy lake trout. Always keep pressure on the fish by keeping your line tight. To do this, the easiest method is just to keep your rod flat and parallel with the ground below you. Your rod tip is going to bend down towards the hole, and that's what's going to support and absorb all the fighting from that fish. All you really need to do is keep this backbone part here nice and flat. And that's another reason that I really like this stiffer backbone on the medium heavy rods, because while this stays nice and flat and I can hold this pretty parallel with the ground, this down here is what's absorbing all those head shakes. If any slack forms in the line while you're fighting that fish, that hook can become loose in the fish's mouth, and one good head shake from the trout can throw that hook. Just kind of the most simple example I can show you of this is if I hold this hook nice and tight, let's pretend my fingers here are the fish's mouth that the hook is lodged in. If this is nice and tight, when I shake my hand, see how that hook kind of stays nice and tight in my hand and doesn't really wiggle all over the place. But if I let all that slack form in the line and I start doing this, notice how that hook is now loose and wiggly, and one real good head shake from that fish can throw the hook just like that. Now, the second thing is lake trout pull very, very hard. Oftentimes, especially when dealing with a large fish, they'll go on a really long, fast, and forceful run and peel tons and tons of line off of your reel. Now, your first instinct is probably going to be to put an end to that, tighten your drag up, and start reeling. But actually, that is the worst thing that you can do when that fish is going on a nice, long, hard run. This is the point in the fight where the fish is at his most powerful state and exerting all of the energy and strength that he possibly has to get away from you. He's working as hard as he can to swim back down towards the depth. So he's putting all that tension on the line while you're also making sure that you keep the line nice and taut. So by increasing your drag or even starting to reel, all you're doing is putting more strain on the line and making it more likely to break. So to kind of prevent this, what I like to do is after the hook set where I have a nice firm drag, I'll actually loosen it up just a little bit. So if that fish really starts getting some strength and pulling line out of my reel, it's kind of a check on myself to keep myself from putting too much strain on the line. Even if I forget and like start reeling and getting all excited or something like that, it's still gonna have enough to where it can keep peeling line against me reeling, and that's gonna prevent my line from snapping. Once the fish stops running, however, he's most likely going to be extremely tired because he just exerted all of that energy. Now is the point where you want to start reeling and trying to bring that fish back up. On heavier, more aggressive fish, a good tactic to help you retrieve line more quickly is to lift the fish up using brute force and actually lift the fish using your arms and the tip of your rod, and then quickly drop the rod as you reel and take up all of that slack that you just created before the fish can swim back down and take up the slack. Depending on the gearing ratio in your reel, you can actually retrieve several feet of line at a time by just doing that method, and it makes it a whole lot easier and quicker for you to quickly get that fish up under the ice. Once you have the fish up under the ice, this is the most crucial part. Now is the easiest time to lose a lake trout. Keep pressure on the line to avoid slack and watch down the hole as the fish swims underneath. Do not force the fish into the hole, however. You want to just kind of guide him using the tip of your rod and your line while keeping it nice and taut, and you want to just guide his head to the hole. And one important thing to note too is try not to drag the fish's head around the side of the hole and up, because all that's going to do is it's going to also drag the lure against the ice, which can also pop the lure out of the fish's mouth. Like I said, once you have him up under the hole, just kind of let him gently swim circles under the hole while applying gentle pressure and just try to guide his head to the hole. Once his head comes into view and is directly under the hole, go ahead and just give gentle pressure and pull the fish's head up into the hole without pulling the lure across the side of the hole. Now, this is the important part, landing the fish. His head is in the hole and everything looks well, so your first instinct may just be to go ahead and pull him up by the line and land him on the ice. But don't do this. Doing this is usually fine on smaller fish, but on a big heavy lake trout, it's likely to snap your line, sending the fish back down the hole. The safest method to land your fish is usually going to be to get down, and while holding the fish up with your rod in one hand and keeping that gentle pressure on it, don't bring it up above the surface of the water. Keep it in the hole under the water, but to where you can reach it. And then use your other hand and go ahead and reach in and grab it by the gill plate and then lift it out that way. And that way, there's no way that you can have your line snap and lose the fish. However, while this may be the easiest method for you, grabbing a trout by the gill is never a good idea because it injures the fish. So if you plan to release the fish, that may not be the best method to use. So instead what I like to do is I like to do everything the exact same, get down, keep pressure on the fish with one hand, and I'll usually reach in and I'll put my hand underneath the fish's head between the pectoral fins, but I won't squeeze or do anything like that, and I'll just kind of keep my hand there underneath the pectoral fins, and usually I'll spread the fins out so they stick out past my fingers kind of like that, and I'll just kind of hold it there, and then I'll go ahead and lift it out by the line. And the reason that I do that is it doesn't injure the fish, and if my line breaks, I can then still grab the fish if I have to. But if I plan on releasing my lake trout, which most of them I do, I really don't like to go into the gill plate because you can injure the gills, which would cause the fish to die, unfortunately. Lake trout are really delicate, and handling them carefully is an important and necessary step to a successful release. Once you have the fish up, try not to set it on the snow or ice. I like to support it under the pectoral fins, kind of like we talked about a minute ago, with one hand, and then pop the hook out with the other. And then I'll take my free hand and I'll support the tail for my super quick photo holding the fish. And speaking of hands, always get your hands wet before handling the fish to help protect the fish's mucus-like coating. This coating helps protect them from bacteria and other illnesses, so if it's damaged or removed, the fish may go back and look like it was released successfully and then die at a later time due to illness. Also, don't apply any pressure or squeeze the trout. Firmly hold the fish at the base of its caudal fin, behind the anal fin, and then under the pectoral fins without squeezing your fingers together. These two areas are going to be the safest place to hold the fish, and it's also going to help the fish not freak out. If you're grabbing a squeeze in its belly, or squeezing its head, or trying to hold it by the gill, the fish is going to freak out, and you're going to drop it, maybe injuring it, or maybe injuring the gills, or squeezing too hard and causing internal damage on the fish. So if you plan on releasing it, that's not the best method to use. And if you do that, you don't have a choice and you have to gill the fish to get it out of the hole or something, maybe considering taking it home and eating it so you don't just send it back down to die and then it's a complete waste. Another important thing is to quickly snap your photo and immediately get the fish back down the hole. The longer the lake trout is out, the more chance that it has it dying after the release, even if it's at a later time. And to release the fish, don't ever just throw it back into the hole. It can take a moment for the fish to revive, so it's best to hold the fish behind the anal fin right in front of the caudal fin and just let it rest in the water, build its energy back up, and then only when the fish starts to swim on its own, that's when you go ahead and release it. This is going to be the best way to ensure that fish's survival. Now, the last and final topic that we're going to talk about real quick before we wrap the video up is how to use your fish finder to catch more lake trout. I'm going to keep this very quick and basic and only show you the most essential functions that will really make a difference. So this is my Garmin Striker 4 portable unit, and this is the main unit that I use every time that I go ice fishing. I really love this unit because the portable kit comes with obviously the Garmin Striker 4. It comes with the ice fishing float setup, the transducer, and it also comes with this really cool carry case, and it even comes with the 7 amp hour battery in the back. This kit goes for under $200 and in my opinion is the best budget fish finder that money can buy. This thing has so many features packed into it and it's absolutely amazing. So first, make sure that your transducer is pointed perfectly straight down to ensure that you can see your jig and the rest of the water column directly beneath you. Get your unit powered up to your main screen, which on the Striker 4 is going to be this screen right here. Now, I prefer traditional graph mode, so that's what we're going to talk about today, but the Garmin Striker 4 does also come with a flasher and also split frequency, as well as so many other options that you can check out at a later time. But let's go ahead and go into traditional mode, and we're going to take a look at that. So this is your traditional graph, and this is what most of you are going to be used to seeing on a typical fish finder. So obviously we're not in the water right now, so you're not going to see anything, but the bottom would be here. This is obviously the top of the water column. Over here, it's going to digitally tell you the depth that you're at, that the sonar is reading. This is your water temperature, and then over here, it's going to give you different increments of depth through the water column. And over here on the right-hand side, this is going to be real time. So everything that's happening right here on the right-hand side is what's actually happening right now. And as it scrolls over here to the left, it all becomes history. So you can look back and you can see maybe there was a fish up here 30 seconds ago and you can see the history of what that fish is doing. Maybe it swam down and then it swam up a little ways and so on. So for example, if you're jigging a lure down here at 40 feet, it might look something like this. Your lure is right here, right now, real time. And as you jig it up, it's going to start moving back in your history. As it falls back down, it moves further back, and it's just going to continue doing that. Or if you have a dead stick just kind of sitting here at 40 feet, you're just going to have a line just like that. And that's what it's going to look like as it moves across your screen. And remember, what's happening right here
is what's happening currently right now. Everything that's happening over here has already passed. So if you have a line coming up like this, that's a fish kind of rising through the water column, nothing over here matters because that's not where he actually is. Where he actually is going to be up here at this exact time. So additionally, let's say that you're jigging up and down right here. You have another line that comes up from the bottom, and that's going to be a fish coming up to examine your jig as you jig up and down. This is the time that when you see that lake trout rising, you want to drop that jig all the way to the bottom. And typically what you'll see is that lake trout will come up, it'll meet your jig, and then it'll follow it down. And that's when you want to just leave that jig just resting down there on the bottom and see if that lake trout takes it off the bottom. If it doesn't, bring it back up. Continue jigging. A lot of times you'll see the lake trout follow it back up again and just kind of hang out with it for a while. Check it out for a little bit. Maybe you'll see the lake trout swim back down towards the bottom and disappear. And then 5 minutes later, maybe you'll see it come back up, and that's when you finally get that strike. So that's how using a fish finder in its simplest form is really, really good to help you catch lake trout, because that method that I showed you earlier is useful, but it's not as useful if you can't see it in real time what's happening. If you're just guessing and going without a fish finder, it can be a whole lot more difficult. Now, additionally, this fish finder will help you figure out if you're doing something wrong, because let's say you've been marking a fish just kind of following your jig all around for 20 minutes now. That might tell you that the fish is interested, but it's not quite ready to commit, and maybe you need to change something that you're doing. Maybe you need to raise it and drop real quick to get that fish excited, or maybe you need to bounce it off the bottom, or maybe if the fish really isn't interested, you need to change color. The fish finder can give you that information because it'll tell you that there's a fish down there that's been there for 20 minutes now and it just doesn't seem interested in what you're doing. But specifically on the Garmin Striker 4, there are a few more features that I find incredibly useful and that I'm going to show you real quick. The first is called bottom lock. So what you do is you're going to go into your menu here from your main traditional graph screen. It doesn't work if you try it from this screen. You have to be in your traditional graph screen. You're going to go into your menu. You're going to go to zoom. And then after you've gone into zoom, you're going to come down here to bottom lock. Now, essentially what bottom lock does is you'll notice that the numbers on the side here changed. And that's because now this is going to be just locked onto the bottom rather than the entire water column. So let's say you're in 50 feet of water. Instead of seeing 50 feet of water column, you're only going to see, in this case, the bottom 12 feet, or I can even adjust it. And I want to see the bottom 17 feet or the bottom 18 feet of the water column. Maybe I want to see half the water column at 25 feet. So all this does is it gives you just part of the water column. And what that does is, because you're fishing for lake trout, usually near the bottom, you really don't need all this upper stuff. So typically when I'm using bottom lock, I'll actually bring it all the way down to about 12 or even 10 feet off the bottom, because really that's all I need to see. And it gives you a nice zoomed in picture. So instead of the picture being down here at the bottom and you see your jig just like right here, really, really tiny, now this entire screen is your jig and you can see the lake trout coming up. So it really helps me out when I'm fishing in great depths. I usually don't use this if I'm like 20 to 30 feet of water, but anything over 30 feet of water, I find this to be very, very useful. But sometimes there are fish higher up here in the water column that you won't be able to see while using bottom lock. So we're going to turn something else on. So we're going to go back into our menu, and we are going to go back to zoom, and we're going to come down here to what's called split zoom. Now essentially what you've done is you've given yourself the entire water column over here on the right hand side, so 0 all the way down to 50 feet, so you can see the entire water column. So maybe a rainbow trout swims through up here at 10 feet and you're like, oh, I could catch that, so reel up real quick, catch the fish up here at 10. But also you've got that zoomed in on the bottom function over here where you only see the bottom 10 feet of the water column. So when you're down here, you can see your jig a whole lot more effectively, and you can also still see stuff that's higher in the water column if you choose to. Now the next thing that I'm going to show you is another very, very useful tool for lake trout fishing. So real quick, I am actually going to turn off split zoom. And the next thing that I'm going to show you is called A-scope mode. So what you're going to do is go down to your sonar setup menu. You're going to go to appearance, and you're going to go to A-scope and turn that on. And then you should be able to back out through the menus. And basically what you'll get is this little thing over here on the right hand side. And what that essentially is a flasher. So now you've got your traditional graph here and you've got a flasher. So kind of how I was talking before, how all your real time, what's happening right now is going to be right here on the right hand side, and then everything over here is all history. The flasher is essentially all real time. So instead of having this tiny little spot you're looking at right here, now you have this nice large strip that's all real time. So you'll see your jig moving up and down like this, and it's going to be a bar across that flasher screen. So you'll see this is your jig moving up and down, and then you'll see when a fish comes in, you'll see another line coming up, and it's going to be very, very obvious using that flasher, whereas using the traditional graph mode, it might take you a second to realize kind of what's happening because you're looking at this very fine line right here. Now, another really cool thing is all of these settings can be used together. So if I go back in here to my menu, go back up to zoom, go back down to split zoom, now essentially what I have is I have 4 different things that I can look at, and they're all going to give me a different piece of information. So this is going to still be my entire water column, except now I have a flasher for my entire water column as well. So it'll be really, really easy to see fish that are up here kind of swimming through. And then I've got my bottom lock, and I also have a separate flasher for my bottom lock. The only problem on the Garmin Striker 4 is because of the smaller size screen on this one, all of this info is kind of difficult to see because now notice how my history is much smaller. So I have way less history, but I have a lot more real time what's happening. Personally, for me, when I'm lake trout fishing, the real time what's happening right now is the only thing that really matters, and I don't really need the history, so I actually usually use this exact setup when I'm fishing deeper water past about 30 feet, and it works very, very well. Now, the final thing that I want to talk about before we wrap this up is changing your frequency. So to do that, we're going to go in here, and we are going to go to our frequency, and you'll see the Garmin Striker 4 has 4 options here. Really the only 2 that matter is going to be these ones. The Striker 4 has 77 and 200. The difference between those is going to be the width of the beam that the sonar sees down under the water. The important thing to remember is the smaller the frequency, the narrower the beam is going to be. Think of your beam as kind of an upside down cone that starts at the transducer right underneath the hole, and then the large part of the cone is going to be on the bottom of the lake. What you can do by changing this is get a much more precise image of what is directly below you with less interference from further away, things that don't really matter. In deeper water, the cone is going to be much larger where it meets the bottom than it is in shallow water. So you may be seeing stuff on the bottom that is actually like 50 or 100 feet away from you, depending on how deep you are, not directly below you. I like to narrow the beam in the deeper water to prevent this. So usually in deep water, I will go down to 77. And then what that does is it gives me a much narrower spot on the bottom of the lake that I'm looking at, so I don't get all that extra crap that I don't really care about because it's not directly below me at that time. However, narrowing the field of view also has a much more important function. Oftentimes when fishing for lake trout, you're going to be fishing over a sharp drop or varying depths that can change drastically over the course of just a few feet. If the field of view is too wide, the edge may be much shallower than the center of the beam, indicated here by this quick sketch that I did, causing the fish finder to indicate a shallower depth rather than the actual depth that you're at. So what we're talking about here is you can see that these 2 lines right here, this one and this one, indicate the wider beam that we're going to be looking at. These 2 lines here, this one and this one, indicate the shallower beam. So this is going to be the 77 and this is going to be the 200. Now, let's say that this is us up here ice fishing. We're all happy. We've got our transducer in. Let's say that we have it set to this super wide beam. Notice how we're fishing along this extremely sharp drop right here, and then it meets the bottom down here at 30 feet. So fishing along this extremely sharp drop, notice how the extra wide beam is hitting the wall much higher than the actual bottom. It's hitting the wall here at 25 feet. And oftentimes that can cause the fish finder to give you a reading on your depth of 25 feet, which essentially is going to leave you a 5-foot dead zone that you can't see on the fish finder and you have no idea what's down there. We've got a fish here that's obviously hiding well within that 5-foot dead zone and you would never see him on your fish finder.
Notice how if the beam is much narrower, however, it's set at 77, the beam is going to hit the bottom completely rather than hitting the side over here. So now it's giving us an accurate reading of 30 foot of depth, and that fish has come into view. The other thing that I want to talk about when talking about dead zones is notice how in this sketch here I've included this rock. And this rock is going to be 2 feet tall. So another thing is sometimes a dead zone can be created by an object on the bottom like a rock, or even maybe like a small hill or some vegetation that sticks up or something like that. And essentially what's going to happen is your transducer is going to hit the bottom on top of this rock and bounce back up, and it's going to give you a false reading. So if that rock is 2 feet high on a 30-foot bottom, maybe the sonar is going to give you a 28-foot reading, which is going to leave you a 2-foot dead zone on the bottom. Again, plenty of room for that fish to hide in. So it's important to recognize when you're getting a dead zone, and it's actually super easy to recognize because if you drop your lure down and on your Fishfinder screen, the lure has now hit the bottom. However, there's still line coming off of your reel and it's obviously still dropping. Obviously, there's some kind of dead zone there and your sonar isn't reading effectively. So maybe the first thing you do is try narrowing your beam, see if you can avoid whatever object it's hitting. And if that doesn't work, maybe try angling your transducer in a different direction, or maybe even hopping over a couple feet and drilling another hole and trying to get past whatever that foreign object is down there so you can get an accurate reading and not have any dead zones. Now, obviously, there is a lot more to using a fish finder than just these simple steps that I've showed you, but these are the most important ones and the ones that I regularly use and the ones that help me the most. So we don't really need to cover all the rest of them and eat up that much more time in this video. Using the tactics that I've showed you and the fish finder methods that I've showed you are all you need to know to successfully catch a lake trout. And that's really just about all that I have for you guys today. I know that was a super long video with tons of information to take in all at one time, but I really appreciate you guys watching and I hope that this really helped you have a better understanding of how to fish for lake trout. This is the first informational type of video like this that I've done, so if you guys enjoyed it or found it useful or learned something, let me know down in the comments below, and if you're interested in seeing more content like this in the near future, hit that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on the stuff that I'm posting. It really helps me out, and again, I appreciate you guys so much, and thank you so much for watching.